see here. Where is it? It's... We are in the ballpark. Here we go.
Oh, yeah, there it is.
I think it's
Michelle's grave.
Yeah. Got the seashells.
I mean, I think this is when it really became real for us, is when we came to the cemetery, wasn't it?
Yeah. Brings it all together.
Michelle O'Connell was found dead inside this St. Augustine home. Her death ruled a suicide, a self-inflicted gunshot to the head.
Michelle lost her life. It was taken.
O'Connell's family members believe her death was a homicide.
They say there are inconsistencies in this case.
The investigation was sabotaged from the beginning. Evidence was thrown aside.
They believe O'Connell's boyfriend, St. Johns County Deputy Jeremy Banks, pulled the trigger.
38-year-old Eli Washtock was found shot to death on the 3rd floor of a Laterra condos.
Investigators are calling the death suspicious.
O'Connell's mother, Patty, believes Washtock was murdered for investigating her daughter's 2010 death.
I was an agent with the Secret Service out of college, doing presidential protection, white-collar crime for about 4.5 years. I ended up starting my own business doing analysis on corporations, and I was analyzing statements made by executives. So my personality kind of naturally fits into the idea of either solving a problem or trying to get to the bottom of something that's going on.
John and I met at a local podcasting meetup in the summer of 2016, near where we live in Raleigh, North Carolina. And John and I were the only two people there interested in crime. And so instantly, we knew that we had something in common, that we had to work together. I work in marketing. You know, I have a very ordinary job. And, you know, for years, it's an itch that I needed to scratch, you know. I'm the storyteller. That's really what it all boils down to craft and to piece everything together, put everything in context, whereas John just wants the facts.
I was looking into a case for my podcast, and I heard about Michelle O'Connell. Michelle O'Connell was a 24-year-old single mom and girlfriend to Sheriff's Deputy Jeremy Banks. She died under mysterious circumstances.
And once Javier was introduced to the case, he reacted the same way I did, which was, you know, this is a case we have to dig into more, and it's unresolved. It's one of those cases that doesn't leave you. And so once Javier and I started working on this together, we identified this case as something that we just had to pursue. And he and I both went at it full throttle at that point to just see if we could figure out this case and just dig into it as much as we could. We got the information initially as to what happened to Michelle O'Connell from online publications, interviews that were conducted, and things of that nature.
And I heard that story, and it stuck with me because there's that 911 call.
911.
Hey! Please get someone to my office.
What's going on?
Please, my girlfriend, I think she just shot herself in blood everywhere, please.
She what?
She shot herself. Please.
Okay,
Please get someone here. Please.
Ma'am, I need you to calm down.
Sir,
Ma'am, listen to me.
Sir, listen, hang on. Let me tell you the truth. I'm deputy St. Johns County Sheriff's Office. I work with y'all. Get someone here now.
Okay, because you got 5 people coming.
Jeremy Banks, who was a St. Johns County Sheriff's deputy, found Michelle O'Connell dead on the floor from a gunshot wound that appeared to be self-inflicted.
The medical examiner for St. Johns County Sheriff's Office immediately ruled it a suicide. You have the family saying it's not a suicide. They were convinced immediately that Jeremy Banks killed her. And we found out that there's one person who was at that scene shortly after her death, and that was Deborah Maynard.
I was on night shift, finishing up a call, and my sergeant asked me to meet him at the Hess station for a cup of coffee. And while we were just sitting there talking, having a cup of coffee, we heard a call come out over the radio. Immediately got our attention because we heard that it was a signal 18, which is shots fired. You know, there's a lot of cases you don't remember, but then when there's things like this that happen, you don't forget them. You never will. They just burn in you. So as I entered the house, the first thing I noticed, there was a pair of feet in the doorway. Upon my arrival to the bedroom, I noted a white female laying on her back on the floor. Her legs were slightly bent, and she had little black ballerina shoes on. She was very thin. She had a pair of jeans on and a black top. And I walked over the top. I never touched her. I just looked at her. And her eyes were gray, and her blood was flowing, just running straight back to the floor. There was blood coming out of her mouth. Across the room, Jeremy was crouched and holding a phone. Jeremy Banks is the deputy with St. Johns County Sheriff's Office. So we knew him pretty well. And as I looked up, I also noticed there was what appeared to be a duty weapon similar to mine, an HK-45, with a tactical light on it, laying to the left of the female. My sergeant looked at me, he says, "Get him out of here," which he pointed at Jeremy. So I had to take Mr. Banks outside. Shortly thereafter, they called, and said she has passed. It was at this point that I was removed from this and ordered to go and make family notifications of the death of Michelle O'Connell.
Jeremy Banks gave an interview the night of Michelle's death.
And that was sworn testimony and recordings of that night where the detective interviewed him. And you hear Jeremy's side of the story.
Jeremy, tell me about tonight.
We're at the amphitheater for the concert that went on. And I enjoyed the show. She enjoyed the show from what I understand. Came home and argued a little bit there. We, argued a little bit earlier today, but nothing terrible. But we just said, enough's enough. We're fighting, we're done. I just don't feel like we're best friends anymore. It's not working out. And she agreed.
Right. We were outside in the yard driveway.
My motorcycle's in the garage. I was sitting on it with my head down, just upset about, the breakup. Just waiting, just giving her space. Mm-hmm. And I heard it pop. But I knew exactly what it was. Just instinct. I just said, and I ran inside. I started screaming her name. The bedroom door was locked, and I kicked the bedroom door in, and I found her laying where she is.
And so he calls 911, and the St. John's Sheriff's Office responds.
Jeremy Banks says, "My girlfriend just shot herself." So of course, when Sheriff Shore sees this, he's like, "She died of an intraoral gunshot wound, case closed." And it's almost like the Sheriff's Department just flipped a switch, and it was no longer a crime scene.
Michelle O'Connell was found dead inside this St. Augustine home. Her death ruled a suicide, a self-inflicted gunshot to the head.
There is absolutely no way she committed suicide, not even any chance whatsoever. If you look at the facts and you look what happened and you look what we knew ahead of time, there's no way that she committed suicide. Michelle first was my high school student, and then she worked with me at the Jocker Center.
There's Alexis. Hi, Michelle.
Just watching her be a mother was wonderful because she was so good. She was so good with the children and so good with Alexis. I hired her part-time, and she was working 2 to 3 jobs trying to make ends meet to get everything she could for Alexis. She was driven, just so driven. I told her that she should work with me full-time, and she did it, and she got the job, and she did marvelously. The day that she passed away, the day that she was murdered, she and I went over to the main office to get her key. She told me, she said, I'm going to the doctor's. I am not sick, but it doesn't matter. I finally have insurance, and I'm going. She could work 1 job and have the weekends off and be a mom. And it was what she always wanted. It was perfect. Absolutely perfect. She was killed that night.
Michelle O'Connell's story has gone up and down, and we thought, well, her story's not over. We could definitely take another whack at this. Why don't we just see what we could find? Shortly after we started doing our research, we realized that there was a guy out there who was 10 steps ahead of us, maybe 100 steps ahead of us. And his name was Eli Washtock. He lived in a condominium in St. Augustine. And he's just a private citizen, just like me, just like John. And he hired all these experts, all these attorneys, private investigators, forensic experts. I mean, we were just getting started, and this guy was really hitting the ground running. And so we started looking into him, and that's when we found out something shocking.
38-year-old Eli Washtock was found shot to death in January on the 3rd floor of the La Terra condos. A public records request indicated Washtock was researching the controversial Michelle O'Connell case. O'Connell's mother, Patty, believes Washtock was murdered for investigating her daughter's 2010 death.
Eli Washtock lived in St. Augustine, and after hearing about the coverage of the case that happened in his own town, he started investigating this on his own.
And then he was murdered on January 31st of 2019. And so we started our investigation after he was murdered. And it was one of the reasons why we started looking into this case, because not only do you have the compelling case of the Michelle O'Connell murder or suicide, but you also have the fact that someone who had been spending a lot of resources in investigating this case on their own had just been murdered.
That kind of stopped us for a bit, because all of a sudden this story just changed. So we went down that rabbit hole. It went from being like, hey, John, let's look into this case down in Florida that happened 10 years ago, to an urgent case where we really needed to look into it. All my friends looked at me like, wait, and so you're gonna look into the case too? I mean, are you crazy?
It's your home, and there's no place like Wayfair to make the kitchen sink the entertainment center. However you make it, make your next project like no other.
The new crispy chicken sandwich taco from Taco Bell. Is it a sandwich or a taco? Which side are you on? Try it with special pricing on the app.
Doing an investigation ad hoc as a private citizen, I mean, neither one of us have direct access to the people and information we want. We absolutely have to be more creative. We just don't have the resources. I mean, it's Javier and I working on this case. That's it. There's two of us. Javier and I started trying to get in touch with everyone involved in this case. Once I met Patty O'Connell, Michelle's mom, there's a whole other element there, which is if you've ever spoken to somebody who has lost a child, you always get the feeling that they are not the same person they were before their child died, and that you know something has changed in them. And for me, feeling her pain and her grief was something that obviously hit me very hard emotionally. It doesn't usually work to just go in right in with questions. So you have to connect with the person, understand the person, get to know the person. Patty was very likable right off the bat.
According to Patty O'Connell, Michelle's mom, Eli had evidence that no one had seen before. In the 10 years that they've been looking into this case, for the first time in almost a decade, there's new evidence, right? And if there's new evidence, then maybe they would reopen the case. There is no statute of limitation for murder. There's no clock that's ticking. So whenever there is new evidence, we were hoping that maybe somebody would look into it again. Michelle's mom gave us emails and correspondence. He would email her every Friday with an update. Like, Ms. O'Connell, this is what we found today. Don't worry, don't lose hope. You know, we're gonna get justice for Michelle. And he would list the things that he was working on. So in a sense, we knew what he was chasing. And so it gave us a map of where to start.
Officially, Jeremy Banks and Michelle O'Connell, along with one of Michelle's brothers and a couple friends, went to a concert in St. Augustine. They'd been arguing throughout the night, Michelle and Jeremy.
There are pictures or selfies of Michelle and Jeremy together. Some of those selfies, really tell a powerful story. Michelle is bubbly and happy, and Jeremy is, with a frown, and he looks pissed off in the background. Now, that's just a picture, but it is telling.
Things were definitely not going well with the fact that an hour and 20 minutes later, you're gonna have a 911 call with somebody presumably dead at that time.
We know that the concert ended around 10 o'clock, and we know that Jeremy called 911 at 11:20. So the first thing we did was we went to the amphitheater and walked all the way to the surf station where Jeremy and Michelle parked their car. That actually took about 15 minutes. 0.5 miles ahead.
That's pretty convenient.
And then it took another 30 minutes to get to Jeremy and Michelle's house. That's around 10:40. So that time period between 10:40 and 11:20 is critical because a lot happened within that time period. The timeline is possible, but it's also interesting because Jeremy and Michelle's friends, they followed Jeremy and Michelle back to their house. And according to their affidavit, they actually hung out outside for 45 minutes, which is impossible because then they would have been there when the fatal shot happened. So they would have had to leave. Jeremy and Michelle would have had to have an argument, and then she went into the room, and we all know what happens next.
It's really hard. I mean, it's very analytical, but it's also a human being who's lost their life. And some of that you can, if you really look at it, it can be very upsetting, and you really have to step back from it.
If we didn't look into it, then it would just stay unsolved forever because it could be politically convenient for it to not be solved. And we felt this responsibility to see it through. We felt like we needed to try to get justice for Michelle's death.
And if we were going to make that happen, our next step was to look closer at what the crime scene told us about what happened inside the house.
There's only one witness to Michelle's death that night, and that's Jeremy Banks. Other than him, we don't know what happened. But Deborah Maynard describes that night, very clearly.
There's some really smart people out there in this world who have a passion for justice, and you see it. So I met with John, met with Javier. I'm happy that they're looking into it. This one has a lot of twists and turns to it, and just cover up and cover up and cover up. But that's what Sheriff Shore expects. We don't tell on each other. If you see wrong by another deputy, let it go. Let it go. This is why I lost my job.
Deborah Maynard was one of the first people to enter the residence when Michelle O'Connell was killed. And so her perspective was hard to quantify how much help she was as far as understanding the culture, understanding what happened, and just understanding everything around this case.
I listened to the interview done by one of the detectives.
Yeah, I had a lot to drink.
What was it? What'd you get to drink tonight?
I was drinking beer.
What
Bud
kind of beer?
Light. Bud Light.
Oh.
Big ones.
How many do you think you had?
4, 5, maybe.
Okay.
So if I did the math, I had $100 in cash. They were $7 a piece.
Without any context, you wouldn't know that just a couple minutes ago, his girlfriend died. It was very casual. They were laughing. The audio's really not great, but you could clearly hear his tone and his demeanor.
And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? We're gonna joke about how much we had to drink while we were out? What kind of interview is this? And oh, by the way, why are you doing it in the back of a squad car? Why is that funny when someone's laying in there dead? Why is this funny to you?
There's so many things about this case that don't add up from day one that it's shocking that these deputies and sheriffs and these investigators walked into that scene and walked away with it being a suicide when there were so many red flags everywhere. John and I, from the moment we found out that Eli was murdered, there was no appetite there to reopen Michelle's case. So we knew that we needed to keep going.
There was the holster and the gun, an HK-45, and a level 3 holster. So there are 3 levels of security to get it out of your holster. So not only do you have to use 2 fingers, a thumb and another finger, to push down simultaneously to disengage it, you have to rock the gun backwards to disengage it from the front lock. It's gonna take a little bit of time. But it was his gun. I can't imagine a civilian who would know how to get that out of a holster. There's a method to it.
How did she know how to pull the gun out of his gun belt? They don't just slip out. Deborah also mentioned something about the crime scene that no one had ever mentioned before in any article or interview.
And then I remember distinctly, as I walked through the living room, I looked at the couch and I noticed there was a blanket thrown over the couch, which appeared to be something on the couch. So I pulled the blanket back and I noticed there were all these suitcases. And I thought, why in the world are there a bunch of suitcases on this couch and a blanket over it? Note to self. Well, this to me looks like, hey, them bags are packed and maybe she was going somewhere. Things weren't adding up.
Oh, is this it? Where the suitcases were?
They're right over here. You can't, it's like that blanket was thrown over them, but you can't see it from the picture.
So that's another thing. I mean, the house is kind of in a disarray, but why would there be suitcases? Why would Michelle be packing suitcases if she was planning on killing
herself? Who covered it up? And the fact that Deborah Maynard noticed that.
Yeah. It looks like somebody just threw something over it so you just wouldn't see it.
That certainly made me think, maybe Jeremy Banks threw the blanket over the suitcases after this happened to conceal the fact that Michelle was leaving. That is a possibility.
And then there were pills in her purse and stuffed in her pocket.
I mean,
they're not even. I mean,
they're Jeremy's
in her
pills.
pocket. Like that's just so weird.
Yeah, but the toxicology report was clean.
No, so well, that's the thing. They're in her pocket, so she didn't take them.
It's really interesting because we learned about Eli Washtock after he was murdered, but in a sense, we feel like we were communicating through him or with him.
We wanted to do everything that Eli had done. We wanted to walk the walk he had done, talk to the people he had spoken to.
So we kept looking into what Eli was looking at, and we quickly learned that he had hired a forensic blood expert. Her name was Anna Cox, and he had commissioned her to do a blood spatter report on the crime scene, but that report was never finished. So we reached out and we said, hey, can you finish this report? Can we see what kind of evidence, new evidence that Eli was working on? And in the photos of the crime scene, hidden in plain sight, there's a bloody shirt above Michelle's head.
So this shirt this is a crime scene photo that has been available this entire time. The entire time this investigation's been going on.
Michelle's head was on the floor. And so the idea was, how could there be a tremendous amount of blood on a shirt that's up on that daybed? There's no explanation within Jeremy's official story as to how that could happen.
The only way that much blood could get on a shirt was that it was in direct contact with the gunshot wound on Michelle O'Connell.
And so that is pretty significant evidence that had not been revealed prior to Javier and I doing this investigation.
It was very personal for us, like in a way, because if we hadn't reached out to Anna Cox, like God knows if she would have ever finished that investigation. I feel like we took the baton, you know, and we started chasing the same leads that Eli was chasing. And it was like chasing a ghost. It was like this investigator that laid the groundwork for us, and we were just connecting the dots. And so that got me thinking that, well, you know, maybe there's more dimensions to the story that I'm considering. And that's when I discovered the second autopsy. It appeared that this case was over, but Michelle's family didn't want to give up.
O'Connell's family members believe her death was a homicide.
They say there are inconsistencies in this case.
The investigation was sabotaged from the beginning. Evidence was thrown aside.
So they hired an independent forensic pathologist to look at Michelle's body again. So they exhumed her body and they did another autopsy. And what they found was really shocking because it was another thing that was hidden in plain sight that everyone had missed.
We have new evidence, totally new, that's never been brought to light.
Dr. Anderson says Michelle's death was a homicide. He says blunt force trauma to her mandible, her jawbone, fractured it, incapacitating her before she was shot by someone else.
So all of those people that were making assumptions this was a suicide were unaware of the existence of the fractured mandible. And that's a different injury pattern, and it creates a whole different scenario in the case.
The fact that she had a separate blunt force trauma injury to her jawbone indicated that there was a struggle before she was killed.
Maybe somebody hit her with the end of the gun or with somebody's fist or something really dramatic had to happen for her jaw to break. That right there kind of blew me away, the fact that no one could really explain how she could have a fractured jaw and it still be a suicide. There's so much evidence that's out there that hasn't really been looked at seriously. It wasn't that it was like the thing that was gonna nail Jeremy. It was the thing that could have reopened the case, and nothing happened.
There's an America we build and one we explore. One that's been paved and one that's forever wild. But freedom means you don't have to choose just one adventure.
Today, let's paint with new Behr Dynasty so that you can be proud of your walls.
Where's your furniture?
Oh, we thought it distracted from the new Behr Dynasty paint color. Let me take your coats.
Because Behr Dynasty only takes one coat.
Behr Dynasty.
Go ahead, throw your wine on it. What?
Stain repellent.
It's also scuff resistant. You're paying for that.
Introducing Behr Dynasty, the best of Behr, exclusively at the Home Depot.
With the second autopsy showing Michelle had been violently hit in the head before being shot, we set our minds to getting the case reopened. But as we followed Eli's trail and continued to retrace his steps, we realized that there was another investigation long before ours, or his, done by the state of Florida.
With a couple dozen people supporting them, Michelle O'Connell's siblings took this letter to the state attorney, asking for a new investigation into what happened. They believe O'Connell's death was a homicide, and they think her boyfriend, St. Johns County Sheriff's Deputy Jeremy Banks, was involved.
A couple months after Michelle died, the state of Florida found an investigator by the name of Rusty Rogers. And now, Rusty has no connection to this case. He doesn't know Sheriff Shore personally, doesn't know Michelle O'Connell, doesn't know Jeremy Banks. So he's just trying to look at the facts.
FDLE detective Rusty Rogers was persistent in his review and believed that O'Connell was actually murdered by her boyfriend, Deputy Jeremy Banks. And he was telling her family what really happened.
After Michelle died, the medical examiner for St. Johns County Sheriff's Office looked at her and immediately ruled it a suicide. No questions. But a couple months later, during the state of Florida investigation, that same medical examiner was convinced that maybe it wasn't a suicide. Maybe she was shot by another. That's actually the quote that he wrote in his amended medical examiner report, shot by another. Sheriff Shore was not having any of that. He, you could tell, took personal offense to this, and he was going to stop it. He wrote a 200-page report discrediting the state investigator, Rusty Rogers, and he stopped the investigation.
Sheriff David Shore says since day one, the sheriff's office has been as transparent as can be in the case of 24-year-old Michelle O'Connell. His department found she took her own life in 2010 and that her boyfriend, Deputy Jeremy Banks, had no part in it.
The victim in this case died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and that a law enforcement officer, one of our deputies, almost wound up getting charged for a crime not only did he not commit, but never occurred.
It's not normal for a sheriff to release a report like that, but the thing is that, I mean, you could look at it one of two ways. I mean, a sheriff could say, hey, they're an independent agency, they're gonna run their investigation the way they're gonna run it and let it go. Or you could say, this is so egregious, I have so many problems with this, I'm not gonna allow it to go on, and I'm gonna use my power and authority to put a stop to it, and that's what he did.
But he did it, yeah. He was able to put a stop to it, which is crazy, you know, because, I mean, you would think that a sheriff wouldn't have that kind of power, but what we learned is the sheriff has
almost unlimited power.
Yeah. I've always found that if you see an injustice, you could be a spectator, or you could do something to chip in or try to help. For us, there's that invisible line that most people don't cross, and we just dive in, and we get so deep into the case sometimes. And it's as easy as picking up the phone.
It was clear that if the case was ever going to be reopened, it would have to go through the sheriff's office.
I had reached out to Sheriff Shore numerous times through email and phone calls. When Javier and I were down here in St. Augustine, we went in person to his office to try to interview him.
So do you remember the first time we came down here to St. Augustine's?
I do.
We told him that we wanted to interview with the sheriff, even the public information officer.
I was gonna say, I thought that the public information officer would come out and talk to us. I figured that that was kind of his job and he would be like running interference, but so I was kind of surprised that they just refused to talk to us at all.
He doesn't speak to the media. He has kind of an averse reaction to the media and reporters, like he doesn't like them. We probably spent about 6 months trying to get an interview with the sheriff and just kept getting turned down, but we kept trying and trying. I feel pretty satisfied knowing that we tried to tell both sides of the story. If we would have approached this with an agenda, we would have been shut down. But the fact that we were open to listening to the victim's side of the story, open to listening to Sheriff Shore, and that just shows you how fair we were trying to be to both sides.
And then one morning, he just called me out of the blue, and I'm completely unprepared.
This is John.
Hey, John, this is David Shore from St. Augustine, Florida.
Sheriff Shore, how are you?
I'm good. Am I calling you at a bad time, John?
No, I can speak with you now.
He didn't see you as a reporter. And you're not a reporter. You're like a law enforcement background, and he saw you that way as a peer.
Talk to me, John. What are you... I see where you were a secret... Were you a Secret Service, you said?
I was. Yeah, I worked back under Clinton and Bush 43.
All right, cool.
Do you mind if I record this conversation?
Nah, tape it. I'll have to be slower on my discussion, but that's okay. If you want to tape it, I don't care.
Okay.
That conversation was so candid, and he did not hold back, I mean, at all. I just couldn't believe half the things that he told John.
I won't tell you what I think happened because that's conjecture. But the fact of the matter is, there's a great story in this, and it ain't got nothing to do with Banks killing that girl. It's got to do with Banks almost getting crucified for a crime that he did not commit. Tell me what you think happened. You think Jeremy killed her?
I mean, as conjecture, yeah. That would be where I stand.
He didn't kill her, but I will tell you this, John. You come and spend a half a day with my guys. Well, they don't even need that long, 3 hours. You'll change your mind.
After talking with him, we realized that what other people could perceive as villainizing him, you know, like that he was trying to cover something up, I really do believe that Sheriff Shore believes his side of the story. But I think he became very aggressive against anybody questioning his department or his deputy, Jeremy Banks. He took a very like a father figure role, you know, very protective of his department.
My last question for you would be, why did you choose not to investigate Eli Washtock's death? You being St. Johns County.
Whose staff?
Eli Washtock.
Oh, that guy got spun up on this thing through the World Wide Web or whatever, blah, 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 blah. But because he had an interest in the Michelle O'Connell case and he was allegedly investigating it, we asked another agency to come investigate.
Okay.
All right, Johnny.
Thank you very much.
We look forward to seeing you here, buddy.
Okay, take care.
All right, John.
Bye.
Some like you to think they still...
What happened to me is wrong.
The accusation is false. And she is my wife.
I will not be silent.
Can this man do nothing but evil? I request a duel to the death. If you lose this duel, your wife will be burned alive.
He will answer for what he has done.
Confess!
The Last Duel. Rated R. Only in theaters.
After talking with Sheriff Shore, we realized they answer to no one. They only answer to the voters on Election Day. And
other than that, I mean, Sheriff Shore pretty much got his way. You know, Jeremy Banks is still an officer. He still has a badge. He still has a gun. I think, honestly, what happened, that you had inexperienced detectives walking into the scene. They don't treat it as a homicide. One of their own is the victim. You know, he's crying, and they're taking care of him. I think that it was just sloppy police work. Did you ever read that? I actually never read that before.
On the stone? No.
It says, and now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love.
I think when you look at the totality of the evidence, I think there's a strong case that could be made that Jeremy Banks may have some culpability in Michelle O'Connell's death.
You don't want anybody to forget it and say it's okay. It is not okay. This is not the final chapter. There's so many things that say there's no way she committed suicide. That if we keep saying it, somebody hopefully will listen. And my hope is that somebody hears us and can look at this and say, what happened here? Why did this not go to the grand jury? We want a whole grand jury to look at this. A whole grand jury of our peers and not of their friends.
Not only have we not been able to get justice in Michelle's case, there are all these questions around Eli's death too. Eli's murder is still an open investigation. Eli Washtock is a bit of an enigma. My law enforcement experience told me that they probably weren't connected, but we can't even get the most basic police report from Putnam County Sheriff's Office. So we did what we could. We interviewed everybody that we could find. It's possible that this case could never be solved and that the information will never be able to come out officially. The initial reaction is to connect these two cases, but it could just be a crazy coincidence. So what do we do with the information? In this case, our conduit for providing the information out into the public was that Javier and I put together a podcast, true crime podcast called Criminal Conduct. We used our podcast to be able to provide this information so that it's out there and that people are aware of it.
And I pray and hope to God, with the new sheriff coming in, who was involved in this case, I hope he is his own man, as he says. I hope he takes that stand. I hope he decides, I'm not gonna have this follow me through my term as sheriff, and do something about it.
I would like to think that the evidence that we have uncovered and presented would be something that the officials in Florida would take a hard look at and look at reopening the investigation. However, I think in reality, it's much more likely that the publicity that we would get from talking about this case are more likely to generate another investigation than the actual evidence, which I don't agree with, but if it results in the same outcome, I would be okay with that.
John and I didn't start looking into this because we had some sort of agenda or we wanted Jeremy Banks to go to jail. Our only goal was to bring this story back to